you for joining us here at the JBoss Users Group for DC. Today we're going to talk about dynamic web forms with AngularJS and JBoss Drools BRMS. So to start that off, let's just take a look at a quick agenda. We're going to go through some quick introductions. We're going to talk about why you would use a BRMS, when you should use it. We're going to go through really quick what our insurance use case that we put together here to show you.
The screen is still showing the first slide. I'm not seeing what you're seeing up there right now.
Okay.
Okay.
You have two windows up within that?
It's a presentation mode.
Because I'm still seeing your notes.
Well, he's got it on both screens. He's got the same picture.
Let's switch off. Go back to it. Let's see what happens. I'm still seeing the notes outline view on Ben's.
Oh, you're seeing the note. He's seeing this part. He's seeing the screen. So why don't you?
Want me to just escape that and just maximize?
I would just. Why don't you just mirror the screen? It'll be fine. We don't need the presentation.
Okay.
We don't need the notes and all that stuff.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, can you just, you want to just mirror your screens and then we just maximize it?
Yeah, it's
Presentation view, or either one. But
I did put in presentation view, so we'll just say.
Oh no, that's, I mean, it's not presentation.
Yeah, I did that.
Bottom left, two over that one.
And
Right,
then-
but now he's gonna see that.
I'm still seeing outline view. Huh. Yep. I guess go back to the outline view and.
All right, this will be good enough. All right. Right on. So let's go down to slide 3.
There's agenda.
Okay, so yeah, my name is Spokas again, and I lead up the BTM BRMS practice for Missouri. So the last 3 years we've been concentrating solely on doing a lot of rules and business process work, mostly around the Red Hat products. And with me is Ben-Johan, and he's one of my architects that leads up a lot of our projects. And just a quick view of Missouri, like we have a really deep Java expertise, and we've been partners with JBoss for a long time. In fact, we were partners with them before Red Hat acquired them. We've won some awards, and that's exciting. And one of the big things, and this is one of the things that kind of people focus towards when they're looking at rules or business processes, so it's really one of those tools, it's really one of those technologies that can kind of bridge the gap between IT and business. And so that's kind of what led us to start really making a concentration on using these types of tools. So which leads us to why you would even want to use one of these things. So a rules management system is a way to declaratively model a very large amount of logic. And usually you have these kind of problems where you have like a lot of business logic that's really buried into code, like you have a lot of if-then-else statements. Or it's like moving mountains to try to change some of that business logic. It's just that, people are afraid to touch it, to break it. It's just really too convoluted. It takes a really specific person to go change it. And also when you're modeling logic like this, it's doing the telephone game, right? So somebody comes up with requirements, and it goes through and it gets modeled out, and then somebody makes software requirements out of it, and it gets made into software. So it's going through many different translations along the way. So what a rules engine will do is kind of allow you to make a centralized place that manages all of these business rules. It makes them visible for everyone to see. It makes them easy to change in version, and it also means that those English-like words, English-like requirements that you're writing actually get translated into code. So the kind of things that you should look for when you might be interested in using a rule engine, you have things that are very highly conditional, or you have logic that changes all of the time, or as I said, it takes a very high-level subject matter expertise that is required to tell you whether or not something is right or wrong. So you want to expose that, or just the traditional code approach isn't working well. Things are getting too fragile. There's too much systematic complexity going on to get things done. or your analyst needs to look into things. Or you're in an industry that has just tons of rules that are put upon you, right? So you're in a highly regulated industry. You've got healthcare type stuff, or insurance, like the core standard for insurance. You have a bunch of stuff that's kind of put upon you that changes outside of your cycle. And so you want to get the changes of that logic in your software to be outside of the regular software development lifecycle of everything else. And so that's what we did here. We have a pretty quick example. I'm going to pass over here to Ben. He's going to give some slides about that and give us a demonstration.
Alrighty, like Ken said, we went and created a demo. We went and put the source code up in GitHub. So everything that we will demo today or show you today, you can go and download. You can compile it. You can use it. It includes 2 projects basically. One is a typical BRMS engine with all the rules in it, which is a plain Maven project that you can build. The other one is an Angular app that runs on top of JBoss. So at this point, we use the Angular app that communicates with the REST interface, and we use the REST interface to have the BRMS engine, which I will show you guys now. But it's all up there. And at the end of this, we'll give you guys the link to GitHub, and you can go play with it. So there is a little bit of Angular. To start off, in our case, we said, what will we use for a good demonstration of how to use rules? In our business, we deal a lot with insurance companies, and a lot of insurance companies was built on mainframes that all realized that their technology becomes, obsolete, and they need to switch to something new. So we decided to use a typical insurance application. You do a quote for either, home insurance or car insurance. We took a typical home insurance policy. So what you see there is typically a snapshot of our Angular application, single-page app. In this case, you want to insure a property, you specify an address, and then with a piece of property, you've got a bunch of questions you need to ask. So if you would go about to build this, where are these questions going to live? Who's going to create them? And when you validate them, who's going to validate them? If you ask a developer that is just out of college, he would typically go write the Angular app, you'll put the questions, code them right there in the page, and he will use Angular form validation to validate everything right there and then. And then 6 months later, some business analysts say, hey, we need to change our company rules. It should not say, what's the year built of the property. It should say, when was the property built? So the question needs to be changed, and maybe the type of answers you can give needs to change. So now that developer is not there anymore, somebody needs to go dive in the code and figure out where is that question, and you find out that you see that question like in 5 different places in the code. Which one should I modify? That's where the rule engine becomes very helpful and advantageous when you get to bigger applications where you bubble up all this complex rules and business logic up to the surface where a business analyst can go look at it, and you give that business analyst the opportunity to go change it without having that techie developer be involved in the whole process, or having horrible DBA that needs to go make a table change that needs to be tested in 5 environments before it goes to production, and where everything is nice in your BRMS rule engine. So there's for our demo, that's the app that we're going to use, and I will demo it at the end of this so you guys can all see it. And like I said, where's the questions going to come from? When they answer these questions, what's going to trigger an update? So you will see, typically you will say, do I have a dog? If you answer yes, you want to ask another question that says what type of dog it is. A lot of insurance companies, believe it or not, if you have a pit bull, they will not insure your property. So we will show that, and those are the things you want to look for. If somebody did answer a question, we want to validate that. Are we going to validate it in the front end or in the application code deep inside? In our case, we put this all in our rule engine. So it's all nice in one place where you can view it JBoss BRMS comes with a GUI interface, which we call Workbench, which I'll show to you as well, which has a very nice look and feel that you can go and play with the rules, look at them, find them, search them. So it's not buried in compiled code and nobody knows where it is. So how do you start? Where do you start? It's all nice and dandy. Say, hey, we've got a fancy rule engine, so what does that mean? Where do I start? To start to play with rules, you've got to go and kind of organize them and define the kind of rules you want. In our case, I'm going to switch back to this screen. What do we have? We have questions. We're going to answer them, and we're going to validate those answers. So we've got 3 basic rules we want to define. So if you look at a question, for instance, what does a question have? It's got an order. What type of question is? You can have a drop-down question, or you can have a plain text input question. Is a question required or not? If it's required, I want to show something on the screen that says, hey, this question is required, you need to fill it in. At the same time, do I want to show this question? I don't want to ask the question, what type of dog do you have, if the guy said no for having a dog. So an attribute for hiding or showing a question. Then, now that you have a question and define some attributes on a question, and rules that can define questions, because in a rule engine you can create facts as well, delete facts, modify facts, and see the rule engine typically has a black box that you send stuff into it and it sends stuff back to you out of it. So it's an input, output, black box. In our case, we want to do some validation, so typically we're going to have some rules that do some validation. And then you all played with the online insurance app. After you've put in your whole life in there, it's almost like a background check. You hit the button and they say, okay, it's going to be $2 billion a month, or it's going to be, $100 a month for your insurance. That's where the rate calculation comes in. So we want to have a set of rules that are going to go and take everything that was put in and tell us this is a $500 policy or a $600 policy. How is that going to work? So,
but we also know up front, so a lot of times if you're going to an insurance website entering your data, they'll let you just keep going and going and going until, give us as much information as you possibly can, right? That's great, but and then they'll run the rules at the end and say, okay, well, here's what your rate's going to be. By the way, we've collected 6 pages worth of info from you. But if this was an insurance app for for a call center person, I'm going to be collecting information, and if you hit a do not bind situation, there's no way we're going to possibly offer you something. We want to show that feedback right away, so that you don't waste your time collecting more information than you have to.
Exactly. So see this demo almost as a demonstration of what a call center operator will see or a client. In our case, like Ken said, it was more towards like an operator where you need to get to an answer very quickly for the customer. Where if it's typically for a client, insurance company want to collect more information rather than less.
And so now that we've organized, those are the 4 main things that we want to do, right? And so we're going to throw up on the board, like, here's the basic workflow of going through this rule set. We want to, we know we're going to build up the questions. We're going to collect some feedback, rearrange the questions, and go on this loop until they're done, and then we're going to set off this rating calculation. So we have a plan of attack, and the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to define the domain model. So these are the nouns of the system, and this is we're going to say this is what the question is going to look like. This is what the property and address is going to look like. The interesting thing here, both of these steps are done before we even start playing around with the tool. A lot of times we'll see people go out with the tool and they'll just start going, and that's usually what gets them in trouble, and they won't plan things out. So we did this simple thing, and here's a quick interlude, which is kind of interesting. So, and why it's important for you to think about what your domain model is. It's going to directly affect what your rules look like. So when you write a rule, it's going to look kind of like a SQL statement, pulling something out of a database. And so if I go for a very generic, model. For example, if I wanted to model the answers for this questionnaire as an answer that had a question ID and a raw value and a value type and these kind of IT-centric type domain models that we tend to go to, it's going to make me write rules that say things like, go give me the answer, if I match on answer where its ID is 15 and its integer value is 25, that doesn't really resonate with anybody other than a developer, right? Whereas if I go to a more specific model that kind of sounds more like things that we talk about, for example, a property that has an address, that has the year that it's built, and I can write, for example, rules that sound a little more English-like. If go find me properties that have a roof that's more than 25 years old, right? So a C-level executive can look at that and understand it. A business analyst can look at that and understand it. So that's just the point. That's just the point we're trying to make, is that you have to do some planning before you actually get into stuff.
Remember that the domain model is the interface to the rule engine. That's the language you're going to talk to communicate with it. So it's always very important to pick that domain model to be not very specific, but also not to be too generic. If you make it too specific, tomorrow you may change the property and take the address off. Now suddenly you have 1,000 rules that look at the address attribute, so that's going to affect them. Or if you make it too generic, then, like Ken showed, nobody's going to really understand what the rules do. So that's the language, and if you have that domain model selected very well in the beginning, you're on a very good path going forward. Because if you're going to find out after developing, say, 2,000 rules, you want to change your whole domain model, you're going to find out you're most probably going to have to rewrite 1,000 rules to get the thing working again. Here we just did a wrap up in our demo. We're going to add another part to our domain model, which is going to be our validation messages, and this is a typical example of how a validation message will look like. It's going to have a message and a type of validation. There's an error, there's an information or a warning. Now, looking at the rules, how do these rules look like? In BRMS, there's many different ways of writing rules. The most basic one is we call a technical rule, and it typically has a left side and a right side. It's typically like an if-else statement, a condition and an action.
If-then statement.
An if-then statement. You have a condition that needs to be met, and then if that condition is met, you have an action. So in our case, we're going to have a condition that says, in this case, I've got a property where the roof age is 25. Create me an error message that says, hey, the home's roof is too old. Here's more examples of where we use a technical rule. We have attributes and things like a gender group. Can talk a bit about it in the beginning, where you create these phases where we're going to create a question or validate a question. That typically in BRMS rule language, we call it a gender group. So in this case, we create a gender group or a phase called quote error check. So right here, we will validate all the answers for the questions and see if there's any problem. Like example, the roof is too old, or the home was built 100 years ago. We don't want to insure a home that's 100 years old. You also have interface in the workbench of BRMS, which I will show you, something we call a guided rule. So if you do not know from the beginning how to type in these rules because you don't know the syntax, maybe you're a .NET developer, so you're not quite familiar with the language. It's very Java-like. So C# we should not have a problem, but you can then use a guided rule. You select from the menu, pick guided rule, and it will guide you through it. Say, what do you want to do? Then you will pick like a domain model. In this case, we'll pick a property. Then we'll say, what do you want to validate? I want to validate the address. So it's a GUI editor guiding you to creating rules, which will make it easier. But you will find that in the beginning you will use that more, but at the end you will become more comfortable with technical rules as well. We have other types of rules which we call decision tables or guided decision tables. A guided decision table is typically where you have a set of rules that follow all a very similar pattern. Like in this case, we are calculating the amount for our quote, and all these rules have two things in common. It's all about, do they have a dog? Do they have any previous claims? So if you have a bunch of rules with the same conditions and same actions, putting it in guided decision table makes it visibly much more attractive to a business analyst. If I'm a business analyst, I look at this, I can very quickly see what do I need to change here to change the. This is a very simplified way of calculating the amount for a quote, and it's much more complicated in real life. But this is an example of a guided decision table. So we showed you now 3 types of ways of creating rules. This guided decision table and the previous one where you use the guided rule editor, everything gets compiled into a technical rule. So at the end of the day, all rules under the covers will look like a technical rule with the condition, with the action to it. Then there's yet another way. A lot of times you want to write rules, but you want to write in a specific language. So let's say business analysts would like to say, I have a home that is 5 years old. In the rule engine, we have something called the domain-specific language where you can actually write, if you see right here, you define this when condition, and all the text, that little string that's typed there gets translated into code that looks like that. So you can then just go and write those or select from a guided editor those sentences. In this case, it will say, if property age is or more, where you put that variable in it, it will put a little text input field where you can just type it in. What makes that nice is if you have a bunch of business analysts that knows the business very well, if you put these rules in their language, they understand it very well and they can maintain it, instead of having a developer that has to interpret all their business logic into rules. So this is another way of disconnecting the business analyst from writing technical rules or that's very code-like, and this is more into a business logic, a very easy readable way, but at the same time you define rules.
So whereas the tables were like, I've got templates of rules, the whole rule is a template, and these are, I can template like building blocks, and I can snap these together and make it look kind of a form.
Now, in this case, where does the rule engine live, and how do we access it? JBoss BRMS is a Red Hat product, and it's a typical WAR file or application that you install on the JBoss application server. So it's just like any other application you install on JBoss. It has the GUI interface, which I'll show you. All the rules that you build gets compiled into a jar file or a zip file, library that you can then include in any other application you want. And it runs, like I said, on JBoss, currently JBoss at JBoss ERP 6.4.
Right. So the nice thing about this is, it was asked earlier. So I mean, Drools, it's really based on the Drools project, and Drools is just a Java library. So you could run that just in a command line Java program. You can embed that as the runtime as a dependency on your web application, and that can then pull in your rule sets, which are put in as a jar. So the nice thing behind the scenes, it uses Maven to keep track of the versioning for everything, so it fits in really well with the DevOps life cycles. And actually, at the file level, it actually, every time you click save on the web on the web application, it actually stores it locally in a Git repo. So you can actually see all those saves, and you can pull from that repo and push it to another repo.
You could run this entirely as a jar.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. You can make this a Java SE program.
I'd be interested in trying this with Lambda. Actually.
Yeah, you would have now. You'd have to make one. I don't know, Lambda. Can you refer to other jars, or would you have to make a monster Uber jar?
I think it would have to be an Uber jar. And I'm not sure what size. It's just interesting to think of a rule running in a Lambda environment.
That would be an uber job.
Yes, an Uber.
But is it pretty big? Is it?
I wouldn't say it's not huge, but it would be, for cramming it all into one jar, I would be kind of surprised that you would do that.
For Lambda specifically.
For Lambda specifically,
AWS.
yeah. Well, so like, yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with AWS Lambda.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's just, just trying to I'm trying to wrap my head around. I've never tried that. That sounds like a homework assignment. There would be, it's not redonkulous, but I mean, there's stuff, you know, it would be quite a bit of stuff.
It's not just a method.
Yeah. But as Ben-Johan, he mentioned, this runs in JBoss EAP. That's just, obviously this is from Red Hat, but they you can actually get a runtime that runs in WebLogic or WebSphere, or you can even get this running in just straight Tomcat. So it's not JBoss specific in any way.
Now, you guys, a bunch of you want to know about Angular. So the next question would be, okay, fine, I've built my rules, I've got it all compiled, I've got this nice jar, so I have a .NET app. How am I going to get these rules out of it? .NET's not Java. You guys talk Java. What you do is you will expose the rule engine using a REST interface. So what we did in the demo that we developed was we developed a bunch of REST endpoints, and those REST endpoints will communicate with the rule engine on your behalf. So most of our customers and clients use typical JSON that they send forwards and backwards to a REST interface, communicating. That way, you can use an Angular app that just stores JavaScript, so you can send all your information through a typical Angular REST call. That way, you can do .NET, you can do Java, you can do Ruby on Rails. So even though this is built on Red Hat technology, which is typically Java, anybody that wants to consume this can be any other technology or language, coding language. It doesn't have to be Java.
Absolutely, and we're actually seeing a lot of polyglot shops are moving to this as a rule engine because there's not a good open source .NET solution. There's not a good Node solution. There's some folks working on ports from Drools. There's one called Noodles. But there's not like a rock solid one yet, and a lot of folks will put like an ESB in front of this, like put a camel routes or a fuse or something like that to give it a business interface to move it into their architecture.
Right.
Does DSL support comes with the rules, or it's like
the DSL? Yeah. Yeah, so that's it's something that's built into
the Drools.
So in the Drools, but so if you're doing command line stuff, now if we looked through, you can do that. So with the command line stuff, with like the guided decision tables, the nice little web running decision tables, you have to use the web UI to do that. You can't build that from the command line, right? So you have to you can't have that mixed in if you're like hacking on it from Eclipse or what have you. And you had a project, you were going back and forth from Eclipse to the web project, then the guided decision tables, the guided scorecards, and the BPM stuff has to be built up in the web app.
Is this open source?
Yes, it is. So Drools is the Drools project is an open source project that is it's maintained by the JBoss group, which is funded by Red Hat, but or it's kind of kept alive by Red Hat, but that's completely open source and out there. And then for almost all of the JBoss projects, there is a corresponding Red Hat product that you can buy that is built off that same source code. They may do some more security hardening and bug fixes, and then they provide support to it. But if you buy a subscription with them, you get access to their source code, the modifications that they made, and a lot of those changes eventually get trickled back down into the community versions as well. But all of this stuff you can just ramp up really quick, or go to OpenShift. They have cartridges where you can just ramp up a BPM server or a BRMS and start hacking on it.
Right. So our demo, I will do a little demo, show you guys how it works, and maybe show you a little bit of the inside so you can see how it looks like. Like I said before, the front end is an Angular application. We have a domain model that we developed. I'll show you that. we're going to show you also guided scorecard for doing the rating. Guided scorecard is just one other way of adding rules. There's many other ways. For instance, there's guided decision tree. There is
There's rule templates.
templates. You can even, the guided decision table, you can even write all those rules in an Excel spreadsheet, and it can load that Excel spreadsheet and load all your rules for you. So it's a nice interface. So there's a few others, and we'll talk about some new things they've added.
So we say Demo 2.0, this was actually a webinar we gave about 6 months ago, and so we've been just adding some stuff onto it.
Yeah, we had a first phase, and we put it out there and gave the code out to everybody to play with it, and then we went back again, clean it up a little bit, add some more enhancements, and let's see how it looks like.
Once you select the window, you need to share that one for two on the screen.
Yeah. Come on. There. Okay, so here's a little app. Basically, you fill in the fields. I'm going to fill in a couple of fields. I want to fill in everything. I want to show you the calculation where we do the rating. It will not rate until you fill in all the questions correctly, or at least give it a valid answer. What you will see on the side here is validation messages. It says that there are still some fields required. If you hover over it, I'll show you all the fields that still need to be filled in. But there's no point in telling somebody you need to fill in 2,000 fields if you just start. But it's nice to see that.
And so one thing you're not seeing is like every time that we answer one question, it's actually gathering all of the values from the questionnaire, sending it up to the server, running all the rules, and then the rules are sending back down, okay, here's what's changed in the state. So for example,
I'm showing you my console here so you can see when we send this stuff over. So for instance, let's say we answer this question, you have filed for bankruptcy in the last 1 year, let's say no. The moment I leave, it actually went and made a call to BRMS and came back. So for every time you modify a question, it makes a call to the rule engine. The rule engine fires all its rules and it sends back the questions. Now, each and every one of these questions was not defined in the GUI. It all came from the rule engine. So for instance, if I change this one, have you been convicted of arson? If I select yes, you guys see there's not another question. If I select yes, suddenly ask another question. At the same time, it says you've got a question and you need to answer it. So it says, please indicate previous insurance denial. So if I said no, it goes away. Again, that validation message that you saw here on the side, it came from the rule engine. The rule engine generates that.
Is that Angular being sent down to it? Meaning that's
no, this is just
Angular
JSON being sent.
How it works in Angular, it creates a JSON object, which is a typical JavaScript object. It sends that using $resource, you all know that in Angular, or you can use $HPO anyway. There's many libraries that wraps making REST calls in Angular. It sends that call to a REST endpoint that lives on a JBoss server. It's the same JBoss server that we use to host the BRMS application. That REST end call makes a call to the rule engine, gets the answers back, and sends back. Basically, it sends back a list of questions as well as a list of error messages, or in this case, it's just messages. It can be an error or an info or a warning message. So it sends back every time all the questions and all the messages that needs to be.
It's sending JSON objects back.
Yeah, forward and backwards.
And that's what populate or generating the fields.
Yep.
For entry, not just the populating them, but also the fields that are going to be appearing.
Yep.
And so what if that select one was a toggle, like 3 toggle buttons?
Radio button.
Radio buttons. And depending on, it sounds like you have to have the HTML or the Angular code at least the presentation code already there, and I'm not familiar with how are you triggering that to display versus something else. Sounds like you need logic also in the
Well,
Angular
remember,
page.
you still have a look and feel that you need to maintain. So you still
Right.
have to do a basic page layout. In this specific example, since it's very small, I didn't go and let the BRMS engine dynamically set the order and the layout of the questions. I did the pre-layout in the Angular view, but what it was going to display in that spot, it didn't know. All that information from the rule engine. It said, I need to display a field here. It doesn't know it's going to be first name. It just knows. So I mapped it to the front end, but the front end didn't know the details about what the questions are going to be. So all the business logic specifically is in the BRMS engine. So the front end developer only gets, a task with the layout of the front of the screen. Do I want this to be a radio button or a drop down? That's why we said when we designed the domain model, we will have a fact or object called question. A question can be required, it can be visible or hidden, it can be a type. So I will say type drop down or type radio button. So when it comes to Angular, you can go write a nice directive that says this is a radio button type BRMS question. So in that, writing a directive, you will write your little template that will go and read all the possible options for in your radio button, make that as multiple radio buttons, and then you will typically, for a question, always have a default answer. In mine, my default is not to be any of the options to be selected because I want to force them to select a specific one. Now, you can have some questions that already has a default answer. So typically for a radio button, you will say button number 1 will be by default selected. So that you will define those generic interfaces like I'll write a directive for a typical drop-down button. How would that look like? And a plain input, how would that look like? And then when you get a list of questions back from the rule engine will read each question and say, oh, you're a radio button. So it will just display a radio button there. And the radio buttons will be linked to a specific question ID. And then if you click on one of the radio buttons, it will generate a specific answer for that question. And
So let me see if I'm following you correctly. So in that field, have you been convicted of arson, fraud, etc.? If you said no,
yep.
What if you wanted something else to display? So now you have two possibilities. You selected no, but you want something of a different type to display underneath that, like
So in this case, and I will show you now the rule side of it. In this case, I have a rule that says if question, let's call this question 15. If question 15 is yes, enable question 25, which is the other one you see. So what I will do,
a specific display, right?
Yeah, specific.
So you're sending the metadata down.
Yeah.
What if you want a totally different display?
So what I would say is if question 15 says no, I want you to display question 30.
Okay.
And then question 30 will be somewhere on the page.
Okay, and then it's going to fire and it'll change the view.
Every time when you choose an answer, it makes a backend call. It makes a REST call to the rules engine.
Yep.
Right?
Yes. And that's just, so this is a demonstration, right? So, I mean, if you were making a 10,000 questionnaire, you would probably have it chunked up into sections. So a lot of times when we build actual systems that do this, it'll have a flag on that question to say, this is a trigger question. I want you to send the information, go back and re-render it. And then we'll have scoping, scoping mechanisms to say, I want you to take this page's data and send it back, or I want you to take this section back, or just this particular question. And then also I want you to run validation, and I want you to run validation just on this particular page or this particular section or question group and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, this is just a demo, so we touch anything and just like completely goes and regenerates everything. It's a very small set.
Now, I'm just showing you some of that's under the cover, but here you can basically see we got this question map. It's just a hash map back from the backend. All that is, it's just a Java script object or a JSON object with name values, and there's, for instance, the key of this map is the ID of each question. So the ID here is A dot any previous insurance denials. The A is for, you know, we identify like you've got an applicant and you've got a piece of property. So it's just a string value, but look what it's got. It's an answer type. It's a Boolean, you know, yes, no. The description. You see the description? That's exactly what the question is up there. You know, in which group is it? We've got a group ID. We've got a map object. It's mapped to an applicant. What's the order of it? Order 7, is it linked to a parent question? Yeah, this is linked to parent ID 17. What's the question ID? There's the question ID. Is it required? And what's its value? Now, they didn't, you know, answer this, so, you know, the value at this point is not really set. So every time you click it, it gets this back. So all this amount of data goes forward backwards the whole time. I'll close this again. But anyway, to continue, what I want to show you here is, for instance, let's take this zip code. If I haven't entered the zip code, I haven't touched the field, it doesn't show me an error message. But if I click on the zip code field and I leave it out, it's going to go, you were in the zip code field and you didn't put in a valid answer. Only now you get the validation. Please enter valid answer for zip code. Again, that went back to the rule engine. It validated that answer, says, hey, the zip code cannot be blank. So you need to fill in something. So I'll pull that in.
No, do you still have the 20171?
What's it again?
20171?
171. I think it's a different one. Yeah, we have a rule in there. If you type in a specific zip code, we don't write policies in that area.
Well, I guess we'll see that in a second.
So I'm just going to fill in the basic fields. I'll show some more. We don't do much with the date. But again, for instance, at this point, it just says you need to fill in some required fields. So let's say we put in the living area is 6 square foot. You see now the little red dot.
You have to stand all the time. This is your house, right?
Yes.
It's a standing house, the micro house.
Yeah. So you see the moment I type in something, the little dots that says it's required goes away. So the question, no, it's required or not. If I move on to the next question, wrong button. Right there it says, hey, living area needs to be greater than 500 square feet. So right there, when the rule engine said, hey, you've answered wrong. And what we really only sending down here is we just send back, the rule engine gave us a bunch of questions, and we now only send back to the rule engine a list of answers. So based on those answers, the rule engine sends us back questions. So it works this way. Rule engine sends questions, we send answers. So, and that's how we update it. So for this case, I will say, you know, just to show the opposite. If I make it too big, it says living area needs to be less than, you know, 5,000 square feet. So we'll make it 600. The error goes away. If you got something valid, then, you know, I'm just going to continue with roof here. Let's say it's 1950. It's still happy. You know, if I go make it 1910, it will give you an error. Say, hey, you know, cannot be. We don't insure homes that old. A little bit more involved. Example is, do you have any previous claims? You know, if you select yes, see how it pops out this whole little area. You need to answer a bunch of stuff. Right there, it knows that you need to put in some claims, and you haven't. So I will go here and I'll say add a claim. The moment I do that, it's gone. If I remove this claim, it it should go and tell you now that you need to add some again. And then you've got the same with, you know, do you have any dogs on your property? You say yes, it will pop up this whole section. You can add, you know, whether you have dogs or not. And that's how we dynamically generate these questions. Now, how does the rule engine look like? this is BRMS. This is the Workbench. You log into this app. It's a web app running on JBoss. Here it shows you all the rules that you've got, all the files. Up here you can say new item. Remember we said a technical rule. There's your typical DRL file. There's the domain-specific language definitions you can add, and a bunch of other stuff. There's a scorecard. Now I'm going to show you each one of these. I want to start with, you typically create file names that mean something. So I said, your question construction for the applicant. So right here you can see, here's the questions for the applicant. Have you filed for bankruptcy? There's literally the question in there. Have you been convicted of any arson, fraud? There's the question. First name, last name. And like I said, these guided decision tables gets built into technical rules. So right here you've got the editor and source. You can go and look and see how that rule would look like, in a typical technical. This is how it gets compiled down. This is what's going to execute. We have another one for the property. So of course the property's got a little bit more involved. What type of question is? We've got Boolean, we've got date, we've got integer. Yeah, we've got the zip code as a.
Oh no, is that an enumeration? The answer type?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So here's this kind of cool. So see this answer type, which is a custom type that we put in here, and we want it to be the string Boolean data, data integer double, right? And so we can create in here. That's we create that as an. Did you create that as an enumeration or in the particular table? So on the table, you can say, I want this column may only have these particular values. What you can also do is create an enumeration that would be a list, or you can pull an enumeration from some external code as well. So.
Yeah. So, and why would you do something like that? If you have a business analyst, you don't want them to go type something in that's not going to mean something. So by doing this, you can give them the option to pick from only what you want them to select. The same with what kind of group you've got, property or applicant. In this case, we just got an applicant and a property that we validate.
How about if you wanted to have test cases? So a business analyst, you didn't want them to have to be a developer yourself, but if they wanted to enter a rule and also contribute to test cases for it to validate that, would they be an ability for?
It's got built-in, they call it test scenarios. Now this is inside the rule engine, so you can use this to validate your rules, to go and test that they actually do what they're supposed to do. Of course, you can then go write test cases or test scenarios outside of the rule engine. Whatever is consuming the rules, the application, whether it's .NET or Java or Ruby on Rails, you can write your test in that hill. But within BRMS, you do have test scenarios. This is typically a scenario. You specify your input. In this case, I've got a property. I'm going to specify the attribute year build is 2016. What rules do I want to activate? In this case, remember we said you group your rules together, like we want to create facts or we want to modify facts. In our case, we created a gender group called check for errors. In this case, we're going to say fire all our quote error check rules, and then we're going to say what do we expect. So in this case, we expect that the property attribute year build will be.
It's going to generate. There's a rule that's going to create a quote message that's going to say, you're of this particular message. Your bill cannot be greater than the current year.
Yeah.
And so I like to look at these as like unit tests for analysts, right? So they can go in here and they can make a bunch of these. You can run it. If he clicks on run scenario, right? Run scenario, you'll see that he gets a green bar and he can feel good, and he can go home. Or no.
In this case, it says didn't match. The reason for that is that the property wasn't set.
Oh.
We've changed the property object domain model outside the ruals.
You made changes to the code and you didn't update the test, and it's on.
Yeah.
And it's on recording for posterity. But what's nice about this, you could click this and it'll get green bar. But if you have say you have 50 of these rules, and other folks have put in these particular rules, you can run all of them and then see if they're read, see if any of them come up. So what we typically like to do this, so the analyst will come in and put in a new rule, and before they save and before they make it final, then they'll go ahead and run all of these rules to make sure they didn't break somebody else's rule. So, but at the same time, it's not as it's not as in depth as like a unit test or an integration test. And so, since we typically wrap these types of rules around in a RESTful web service, then we'll create a bunch of integration tests for like SOAP UI or Postman or something like that. That'll let me chew through a whole bunch of scenarios to make sure that I get the right output.
But at least here you can see typically what it will look like if a rule failed. You put this little exclamation next to the attribute that you're testing, and it says actual doesn't match. So this property. This field property does not equal year build, and the message doesn't equal year build cannot be created. So that's what it looks like. It's got the, go ahead.
Okay. So the property is the field name?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of confusing. Yeah.
Property and applicant.
These were, yeah, it's kind of confusing. So we did use property as the property, and message is something that's part of our domain model, right?
Yeah.
That we create. So we created a quote message is a POJO is a domain model that we created, and one of its attributes is property, and one of its attributes is message. So those are, since those are kind of generic, we should probably use something a little more specific. But this is just like the guided rule, so that the analyst can say, well, okay, I'm going to click on there is a quote message, and then it's going to drill down, and I can select from a list of the appropriate attributes. So it guides them through clicking and not having to guess or know too much about the specifics.
So it just refers to that object. And just to show you guys, you click on that, and it will ask you what other field you want to do a test on. So in your case, the property, it is confusing.
So if you put priority there,
I can do priority. I can add that.
And then you delete the other two.
And you go there.
Yeah.
I can take that away.
And then change the priority to something. Oh. Run it. Yeah.
So also it has this audit log, so you can see which rules was fired, and you can scroll there. So it helps that sometimes the rule engine is not going to prevent you from writing two rules that continuously contradict one another. If you say, if rule A is true, set the flag to be required. And then you can have a second rule that says, if A is false, also set the flag. So now you can have these two rules that continuously work against one another. When you start to write 1,000 rules, you may not know that rule 999 is affecting rule number 3. By writing these test scenarios, when that happens, you can see it immediately what happens. Now, typically, you can do that outside BRMS as well, but it's a very nice way of also debugging sometimes if you have certain issues.
And so, like the Eclipse plugin will actually draw a pretty little graph of like where all it'll draw, a node graph of all the rules that fired off.
Now, what we have as well is, here is the guided rule with the DSL. I just want to go to the editor. Typically, if we have a quote and you guys want to see how that looks like, here you define your rule definitions. So right there I said, when to write these domain-specific languages, you need to indicate which part is the condition and which part is the action part of the rule. In this case, when in square brackets indicates a condition. So you say, I have a condition. The text is going to be, if we have a quote, and then the equal sign is the separation between the text representation and the actual code. It says, if we have a quote, actually means that I have a quote where its ID is not null. So, and then when you go and add a rule, you can just select from that. So let me go there and.
It was great too.
By the way, you can click on this little button. It will show you all the rule files that you have open. So I can go to this one, and I can click on this plus sign and you see right there if property age is, so as you define these domain specific language sentences, you can just go pick and choose from it. So a typical business analyst can then go and write their own rules by just picking those sentences, which means something more than just my scorecard or output field. The following does not exist. So there's an example. And then we have the scorecard. And what I want to show here is when we do the demo and we actually go ahead and we fill in all the fields, suddenly you see all the messages goes away. It actually found out there's no more required fields, everything's filled in, everything's valid. Then you can hit calculate quote. So when we calculate a quote, it generates a quote, it gets an ID, and it says that's the amount that the quote is going to be, and we calculated something called the risk, and that's where we use the scorecard. The scorecard in the rule engine is typically where you evaluate a set of attributes, and depending on the value of those attributes, you can rate it. And just to show you in this case, we created a scorecard, calculate quote risk, and we were looking at a bankruptcy check. If the guy said that the field for bankruptcy is true, add 10 points to the score. Okay, so it's risk. The next thing is fraud. If this guy got the fraud check to be true, 20 points, we add that. You see how the risk goes up. And then a more, I would say, understandable example would be the property's age. If it's just built, then the house is not going to fall into pieces or break into pieces. It's pretty new, so the risk, if the age of the property is less than 15 years, very low score. But you can see as between 15 and 20 years, it goes up to 10 points. So as the age goes up, you see how we increase the score or the risk value. The same thing with the roof. Insurance companies, when your house hits 15 years, you will suddenly see your policy go up. And the reason for that is, as the roof age goes up, they increase the risk.
So what's nice about this is if you were going to, otherwise you would have to create a big series of tables to kind of do this thing. But why can you show them the source? This thing's a big hot mess, right? So there's this thing called PMML standard, which is a standard of kind of calculating these types of things. So when we create the scorecard, it creates a whole litany of rules that go through and do this collection. So you could make these quite complicated. So we made this all based on a particular quote, but you could have, for example, you could have it go collect, add to the score for all of the quote messages. For every quote message that's an error, it could raise the score. And you can have that correlated with the quote or the applicant or what have you.
Yeah.
So you can make these quite complicated, but so this is just a quick and dirty way to do that, rather than hack your own rules to actually do it.
And again, this is designed for that business analyst. If you ask a business analyst to go and see if the risk rating is correct, if he looks at this, he will be able to tell you, yeah, I think it's okay now. You don't need a developer or some person to interpret it for him. Because that's a problem with today's business. A lot of the business analysts are kind of held hostage by the developers because they say, I want this change, but they cannot do it themselves or go verify that it's done. A developer needs to do it. And it's got to go through this very rigorous testing to make sure it's done. And every time you just tweak it, it's got to go through the whole complicated process. With this, they can go right away, go check it and say it's wrong or not. And they can change it right there and say, build it, deploy it, and they can focus on what they want to test because they know exactly what they've changed. Where you don't know if you ask a developer, yeah, I modified the code. Who knows what they modified? They modified it. There's 3 more errors, instead of solving something.
And this is and the scorecard is one of the older things. There is actually an Excel version of it, so you can actually, if you have a very specific format that you put things into these columns, and then you can upload it in here, and it will grind it up into rules as well that way.
Okay.
But I think we've shown pretty front to back all of the stuff there in the rules. We've kind of gone through this use case. So I think would you like we can just open up for some questions, or if you guys want to crack in and look into some code or that sort of thing.
I have a question. So
Sure.
what does it look like when maybe you have a pre-created data table that gets rendered in the front end? So and it's implemented, how's it looking in BRMS? Like when you have a data source that has the data table, or kind of like the table already associated with it. You have experience with that?
So it's like a data table as far as there's like the refer to the facts?
Yeah, essentially, just like, I guess it's more like a legacy application implementation where you have data table driven solution.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's not necessarily a web application and they want to migrate or leverage the rules engine in some form or fashion because they want to go to a web application. So
Okay.
they have a data table associated with rule sets as a data source.
Okay.
And then they're porting it through BRMS. How does the content get rendered inside of BRMS is what I'm kind of curious about, or is it something that's not editable, if you will, from a standpoint of if you're the analyst and then you're going in and you try to make a change, because I would actually, I'm just saying ultimately it's a context of recycling existing functionality is what I'm getting down.
Sure. So I mean, if you had it you're talking if you had you're talking more about rules or data, first of all.
Data that is used for rules.
That gets put into rules, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of folks will use. So if they have an existing domain model, what they'll find is there are some gotchas about that. Like if you have an existing Java domain model and it imports a lot of stuff, you can kind of get into trouble with class loading because this does kind of run into its own little memory space and its own little kind of crunches through things. And so a lot of folks will import their domain model, but it will be, for example, it will have a lot of Hibernate imports or these other Apache imports, and sometimes that will kind of get in your way. There are some ways to get around it. A lot of times what we'll do is, and a lot of times it will also be a very hierarchical model, it's a very relational model. It takes me it takes me 50 domain objects to describe a policy. And a lot of times what we'll recommend is that you will go through and make a POJO model, make just a regular, a thinner, flatter, more descriptive model, and then transform between the two. Because usually those older domain models are going to go away at some point.
Yeah. At the same time, you don't want your BRMS to become the next piece of technology that's going to hold you hostage. So you want to keep the rule engine completely independent of your actual application. So remember we said that domain model was that interface. Even if you have your database table with, say, 2 million rows and you want to get those objects in the rule engine, it would be better, like Ken said, to develop that very lean, generic domain model. You load that stuff outside of the rule engine, and then you inject them into the rule engine in the form of a very lean, more generic model. And what you will do is, let's say you have, in our case, a property object. But maybe you can get it down to what we said, just an answer with a value. Then you convert all that stuff into a very simple domain model, because the rules, they don't need the other 200 attributes on that object. They only need 3 attributes. So there's no point in sending that ton of data into the rule engine. By doing that, your application is also not held hostage if you decide tomorrow that I don't want to use this rule engine, I want to use something else. You can literally take it out and put something else on it.
The idea is write your APIs to what makes sense to what you're doing, right? As opposed to around the technology, and that goes for any technology, including rules. So you've got to remember, at some point, ultimately, you want this to be kind of separated from the IT a little bit, so as close to normal English as you can get. Obviously, this is still a fairly technical solution, but if you can gravitate towards things that are more English-like, or that at least make sense quasi-sense when you read it. They don't need an extra, explanation about how that was constructed. The more successful that's going to be.
Yeah, that definitely answered my question.
A lot of our customers will literally load stuff from a database and then they will just inject it to the REST interface into the rule engine, fire in rules, and they get their answers back. That way you don't have the dependency on a database. The rule engine stays that little black box that you can move everywhere. Alrighty, any other questions?
I do have.
Yeah, sure.
So it's for the single page application. What do you? So I'm trying to understand what's going on behind the screen. So if you have more than one pages for the application, so how do you define the rules for each page?
So this is a demonstration. So we picked one page. I'll give you an example. We have an insurance company that has many pages. What they typically do is they call each page a questionnaire. Okay. So as you remember, Ken said in the beginning, some insurance companies let you go through 20 pages, fill in everything about your whole life. They will typically group each page as a questionnaire. And then a questionnaire has multiple sections or groups on the page. If I would look at that, I would say this is a questionnaire. It's got two sections, applicant section and property section. Inside each section, I would say I have a list of questions. So my domain model will now not just be a list of questions, it will be a list of questionnaires. So let's say I call this page 1. So my questionnaire ID will be 1. Now they're going to click, instead of calculate here, we click a button, say next. Maybe that's a little chevron up there. You've seen all these insurance companies. They start with your personal info. Then they want to know about the drivers. Then they want to know all about the cars. So then you jump to the second questionnaire, which asks you all about the cars. All that's going to happen, the front end is going to say, give me all the questions for questionnaire 2, which is for cars. So suddenly, ka-ching, the page will all have just questions about, how old
But
your
also
car.
remember, we have multiple instances of the questionnaires as well. I have 2 cars. Okay, well then here I've got 2 tabs. Here's the questionnaire for car 1 and car 2, and they have to live in their own context. Or drivers, I've got 5 drivers, and then you've got 5.
So
questionnaires.
You add now another attribute to questionnaire. I've got a questionnaire ID and I've got a questionnaire instance ID. See, so that's how you will build it out. So in this case, you have 5 pages, you will have 5 questionnaires. But like Shane said, be aware that each one can have multiple instances. Maybe you can have a questionnaire for car, but you have 5 sections. Maybe it's a tab, a tab for each car the guys have. So each of those tabs can represent a section, which is the car section. So you can have multiple instances of a section, for instance.
And so the UI is in charge of how much it cares about, right? So you may be on a desktop and it may spit out an entire questionnaire. And the browser is going to say, this is what my scope is. This is the scope of the questionnaire instance and the scope of my validation. So I might switch over to a tablet, which might cut it down. I'm only concerned about one section at a time. I'm only gonna read through a section, and I'm only gonna validate that particular section at a particular time. And so we typically do that so that the UI decides how much it wants, and then we have the rule engine kind of accept a certain amount of scope, and then it decides that's what I'm going to spew back to you.
So the questionnaire, the car is a questionnaire, and if you have 2 cars, if you let the user enter 2 cars,
then it's going to clone them. So I have a big library of questionnaires, and say, oh, I added another car. Let me look up. This is the questionnaire that refers to cars. I'm going to clone it, and then now I'm keeping track of that within that overall application.
BRMS has something else they call queries. That's typically how it looks like. This query says get answers. It will just say, give me everything that's of type answer. So like Ken said with the scope, the black box rule engine will have an instance of every questionnaire that you've got, for instance. But to reduce the traffic on the wire, you would say, don't send me all 5 questionnaires. I'm going to specify scope, which is a JSON object that just says scope ID 1. What that will mean is give me questionnaire 1. That way it only sends back that little piece of information. So by doing that, it's very efficient by only sending little pieces of information to the screen, and it updates very fast. Instead of sending all 5 questionnaires forward and backwards, you know which questionnaire you deal with, the front end knows, so it doesn't care about the other ones.
And so it's a lot like running a SQL query. I think we did a demo on this a couple of years ago on a fantasy scenario where it was constantly trickling in plays from the NFL, and it's constantly recalculating scores, and when scores are recalculated, it updates a timestamp, and then we had a query say, okay, give me everything since the last time I asked you. So it's a lot like running a query on a database or something.
So, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
On the web form, I can see applicant and the property. So that's what you are doing. Like when I ask you about what is property and the applicant, so the applicant is the first section, it's the first questionnaire, and the property is the second section, it's the second question.
Yes.
And the questions are decided in the rule engine, because like I thought that you define the questions separately and then you run the rule engines on those questions.
This is kind of a hybrid, right? So this is as Ben said. So he's already got the layout kind of set up for some of the more complicated ones. So if I say I want to add dogs or whatever, and then it's going to repeat itself. So we have some directives, we have some widgets that are already kind of stubbed out for that. But for example, the simple types, it's dynamically generating those, right? Or
yeah.
We do have a client that's completely generating the entire UI based off of the rule engine like this.
Well, remember, you start off, if you want to display this page, you're going to say, what questions need to be displayed from the get-go, okay? The first and last name, it's a no-brainer. When you go look at questionnaire 1, I need to know the first and last name. So if you go look at this question construction table, there's the first name. We gave it an ID. We give it a description. That's what you see on the screen. And then here's a required flag. We say this thing is required. So the moment it's required, and the enable, that means it's visible or not. So we decide right up front it should be visible. Now see that one question, any previous insurance denials? We don't want that one to be visible, because why? That one should only become visible if the guy said, I do have any previous claims. And then we have, table show high. You're like, how do you switch that on? Look at this rule. It says, let me start with this one. That's a test rule. In case, let's say I've got an answer with the ID fraud, which means, do you have fraud? And the Boolean value says true. And I have a question that says, any previous insurance denials? So those are my condition. I need to have an answer that says the guy has, committed fraud. What do? I modify the question, and I set enable to be true. See right there? I flip the flag. Now I make that question visible. So when it sends back the list of questions to the screen, it's going to go through, and Angular goes and say, I need to bind. Oh, this one is true. So what it's going to do? It's going to say ng if or ng show equals true. It displays it. And if the question is not there, it's not even going to bind it because there's nothing there. So that's how we switch it on and off.
The Angular form you show is just what I thought is first when you show that the form. I thought it's an HTML5 with the Angular attributes in it. So it's not. It's binding everything from the back, like the rules engine. Right?
Yes. Now remember, this is a demo. So for the demo, it was built for demonstration purposes. In this case, I didn't do it completely generic. To do that, you've got to streamline it quite a bit, and I've got to put a lot of work in the front-end GUI, but typically people don't even see under the screen. For our customers that we do it for, we do it that way. I'll show you if I refresh this page. For our customers, the screen looks like, now it's already been initialized.
Let's just have
but
faster.
If you started,
let's just have faster run.
Yeah, say again. Okay,
so you primed it, so now that's how
fast
it.
Yeah.
That's that, which is fine. No, so what he's saying is, we have seen folks completely blank screen, and then it goes and runs, and then it builds the entire questionnaire. That's quite a bit of work.
Can you see the view source of that?
Sure.
Yeah, just to show you, that's how the screen looks like. When
Right,
start
but
it,
you
there's
just have
nothing.
everything hidden, right?
And now it's going and says, hey, initialize, get me everything from behind the screen. There it is. So in this case, I did write some HTML input fields. I just said that input field doesn't know which question really, so that I can do the layout. But if I wanted to completely generic, I have an order on my question. So I would say all questions for section A, find them in this div, for instance. And I'll have an ng repeat going by the order number. So I'll just go question 1, 2, 3, and just find them. And that's like what I explained to this gentleman. Instead of writing an input HTML input field, I'll write a directive, and I will call it the BRMS text input directive. And all that I will pass to that input directive is my question object. Inside the directive, it will say, oh, it's type text. It will create the input equals input attribute type equals text. You know, if the question say its attribute is type text, if it's a drop down, you know, it will go and say, oh, if type equals drop down, right, it will be select, and then the option list will be the list of options that are there, and you can do it that way.
Okay.
That's what we do for you know, what our customers do, and we do for them.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I don't know how much time. I have 3 questions.
No, go ahead. I'm glad you asked. We spend a lot of time get this here, so I'm glad somebody asked questions.
So what have you seen like a common strategy or approach for migrating like existing rules that are maybe for validation that's written in JavaScript and then rules written inside of you know, the middle tier business layer, like, you know, like extracting or recycling that functionality? Is there like a recommended approach, or are you really starting from scratch? This is what I'm getting at.
The problem is typically a legacy system as this big application with a ton of code, and the rules are in there. I won't call them rules. I'm going to call them if, else, then this. It's in there. Nobody knows where they are, and you cannot pull them out. So typically, what our customers do is, or they have a database, and there's a lot of them is driven by a database. You do select of this database table, and you get a bunch of rows back, and then based on those rows, you do whatever you need to do. You cannot just magically pull those things out and put them in a rule engine. It just, you know, there's no magic involved there. You cannot really do that. So what the customers do is they identify sections of their app, and you start small. Define a section, say, I want to look at this, and can we get this into rule engine? So you will identify that section. You will go build the rules in the rule engine. You'll develop the REST interface, the domain model, and then you will keep in mind the rest of your application. And then you will start to consume those rules. And if that works, you know, we do a proof of concept. If that works, then you can continue and do the rest of the application. But typically what's happening is people have such a big system with an app here and another app there and another app there. But each application or piece of it is like a brain tumor for the next one. If you rip out this piece, the whole thing dies. So you cannot rip it out. So what we tend to do is piece by piece move it out. Then BRMS eventually becomes this independent thing where you can then do what you want to do with your application without it being dying because you want to replace this one piece and you cannot. So unfortunately, if you have all your rules defined in code somewhere, there's no magic way of putting it out. It's right there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, from a greenfield situation, you could probably do something like that where you're using the same. You have really flat Pojo, or not even Pojo, but just you have a really flat, nice domain model that powers your front end, and that you're also using as your domain model for your back end stuff. Then you could say, well, yeah, I could write a rule set that's based on that domain model, and I could call it from the front end. I could run through that same validation step in the back end on the last step. But you know, but you're coming from a point of, yeah, sure, this is I have our carte blanche. I can redo everything. Usually we're not. Usually our hands are tied a little more than that.
Some customers do have a lot of data in the database, and they still use that. It just they have a table that's 200 fields long. They can now pull that out and only identify 5 fields that they really need to use to make decisions. and then they create a domain model to represent only those 5 fields. So then they get whatever they get out of the database, inject those in the rule engine in the form of that domain model that we define, and then we fire the rules. So instead of it going from the database to some application that does a ton of stuff that nobody knows what it does, they just pull it out of the database, insert it in the rule engine, and get their answer back. So they bypass that whole application piece.
So then next, as we are kind of like going closer towards emerging technologies and microservices, so like I put all my rules inside of BRMS. How are you kind of like able to maybe take, if you go back to the BRMS interface here, there's like
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like the DRL kind of rule set. How do I, maybe if I want to, put these inside containers and scale. So is it easy to rip them away from, are they, from the jar itself that contains all the business rules? Or like,
well, the jar is just a library or zip file. So after you've built this is a typical, it's a plain old Maven behind the scene that stores the source code in Git. So after you build this, you can deploy that jar file wherever you want. If you have multiple instances. Remember, we have the REST interface that's in front of it. So, if you can have many JBoss servers that can consume your rules.
well, I guess what I was getting at is that maybe I don't want all of the rules to be pushed over because I'm on a very small footprint, so that I can ultimately maximize the scalability of a virtual machine.
Sure. So there's a lot of ways to organize your rules, right? So within, you can make your projects as big or small as you want, right? So, as Ben was saying, at the end of the day, these are just going to be jar files when you build and deploy them, right? So you can make them very focused or a little bit broader. Within a project, it's kind of like Java syntax where it has package names, so com dot blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And so I can put some metadata in that, say only give me the rules that are in this particular package, only give me these rules that are in that particular package, and then within that, now that I've got these rules, as Ben said at the beginning of this, I can also put agenda groups on each of those rules, and I can say, out of those rules that I told you to give me, only activate the ones that are in this group. So you can see there's like 3 or 4 different tiers that we can slice and dice these things into very small, controllable groups.
So it's still a little bit manual is what I'm getting out of that. It's not necessarily like there's an easy tool that's associated.
Different language script.
Just to give you an idea, you can put easy a couple of thousand rules in there, and it's going to be tiny. So it's not as if, remember, what takes the space and performance up is not the text for writing the rule. It is when it comes to the actual execution of the rules. It depends on your domain model, how complex the rules are. So I can tell you, you can write 50,000 rules. You may only consume 200 of those. That jar that you're going to copy, the difference between 50,000 rules and 200 rules in bytes on the disk is nothing.
And you have to understand, another big deal about the rule engine too is if I have 50,000 rules and I drop some facts in there, right? It's where the whole efficiency is. It's extremely efficient of saying, okay, here's out of those 50,000 rules, here's the 400 that apply, and it fires them off. Like it's just like you're not going to write anything faster than that. So like Ben said, carrying around those rules isn't very big.
Okay, yeah.
And then firing them all off, it's insanely efficient in how it fires them off and how it figures out which ones to fire off. Now, of course, if all of your logic is encapsulated in your rule set, that's no problem. What a lot of folks will do is I'll fire off a rule, and the consequent of that rule will go out and pull some more data out of the database. Well, now you're dealing with I/O, and they'll say, "Oh, my rule set is very slow." And it's like, when they crack into it, we'll say, "Well, you're making REST calls, you're pulling stuff out of the database, you're doing," so we typically move it to, if the rule engine needs something, whenever we can, we'll supply it outside. Before we call this rules, it will dump in all the facts that it needs to get its work done, and then let it get its work done, and not have some of that work be reaching out and pulling more stuff.
It's typically the domain model. They have a table with 200 fields or rows or columns, they send that whole object into the rule engine, where we say, do you need this field? Do you need that field? Actually, no. We only need these 5. Then I go, so why did you send down all 200?
Yeah.
So then they realize, oh, by taking out all the 195, you reduce the amount of data on the line or bits on the network tremendously. Then I go, do you need to send all those every time? Well, only during validation. I'm like, but you are sending it now during construction of the questions and customization of the questions, displaying or hiding. Only send those then through during validation. And they go like, oh, okay. So
Yeah, understood.
the domain model, I find, is the advantage of that is not to limit you, but it forces you to really think what is necessary. What is the real business logic that I need? Developers just put everything in code and everything is there. But when it comes to logic, it forces you to think, okay, I don't need this, I just need that. And because of that discipline, I think that's the biggest advantage that I find with the rule engine. It forces everybody to go through the thinking process, and then they realize, man, yeah, I don't need all of this. So.
Yeah.
I don't know, so my favorite thing, and this real quick, make this the last one. So my favorite thing, I've done a lot of these things, and they'll say we have an existing application. And go figure out what it does and write the rules, right? And then so I'll go do that, and I'll throw it up on the screen, get a big room like this, and throw it up on the screen and say, okay, so this is what your application is doing right now, and you'll get half the table say, no, that's not what it's doing, and the other half, no, that's what we told you to make it do, and then get in this big fight, and it's like the first time that everybody is in the same room at the same time and looking at it, and so that I think that's the power of doing these types of things.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on 8:30, so I think we can go ahead and stop the recording. I'm happy to hang out and take any other questions, but I know it's been a long evening. So signing off on YouTube. Have a good evening.
Location up
All
for the code.
Oh yeah, do you want to put up a slide showing where to find Repo?
Yeah, so we'll post that on the Meetup site, and we'll put the slides that we put up, and we'll put a link to the GitHub account and all that good stuff.
Did you want to have it in the stream, the slide, the where the links are?
Let me find out where that is.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
I don't have it with me right now.
I'm sorry. We'll have to post that on the Meetup. I don't think I've posted that up somewhere yet.
All right, signing off.